religions can be larger than some other types of identity, even things like national identities. So, for instance, there are Catholics that exist in Italy, in Rome, and there are Catholics that exist in Korea, and there are Catholics that exist in Africa, there are Catholics that exist in America. Although it's all ostensibly the same religion, can you imagine that there's probably some different practices that take place and also some different meaning of that religion in the various places? And so many anthropologists question whether you can actually separate religion from other aspects of society, such as politics, economy, and other forms of identity. Now, I also want you to keep in mind that we've spoken before about the evolution of humans and how anatomically modern humans evolved, but also that there is a bit of a time lag between the anatomical features that evolved and also the behavioral modernity. I want you to picture back in time and to question whether, knowing what you now know about the evolution of humans, did religion always exist? We weren't always humans. We were other species. Going back in time, we evolved from earlier species. Our brains got bigger, our understanding got bigger, and we changed. So when do chimpanzees, do gorillas practice religion? No, we wouldn't say that. So when did humans start to practice religion? So although it seems to be a nearly universal quality with human cultures today, religion was not always something that humans practiced. We had to invent it. We had to come up with this concept. And so in much the same way as other types of identity, it's reliant upon the formulations that we make around our own communities. Now, Sir Edward Burnett Tyler can be considered one of the founding fathers of the anthropology of religion, and he believed that, and many people still do today, that religion arose from people who were attempting to understand the world around them, conditions and events that you couldn't explain, things that you couldn't see the causality. So why does the wind blow? Science now tells us the reason why wind blows. You've got air pressure, you have currents of air, you have heat and coldness that move things around, and moisture. But before we had science to tell us some of these things, how did you understand the blowing of the wind? And so Tyler proposed that religion came about through our attempt to try and understand a very uncontrollable world. There are things that we can control. You can watch an animal run across a plane, and we can figure out things about that if we want to chase it down and if we want to hunt it. But something like why the rain falls and why the sun shines is something that it's harder to come to grips with, and took a long time for us to actually go through the processes of trying to scientifically understand this. So Tyler proposed that religion evolved actually as people moved through different stages of culture. The first one he saw as the first stage was what he calls animism. Now, animism is a belief in spirituality everywhere, everything around you, every rock, every tree, the wind, the sun, all have spirits and spirituality in them. That the universe itself has spirituality to it, and that's a way to understand life forces and why people die. That's a very uncontrollable force and something that is hard for people to come to grips with. And it also explains things like dreams, trances, altered states of consciousness, because spirituality is everywhere and you can tap into it with your mind. He saw that the second stage was polytheism, which is the belief in multiple gods. And this is sort of a more formalized system of animism, where in animism everything has it. Every single one of these books has a spirit in it. The walls, the floors, the air, everything has some sort of a spirit. But polytheism is one where there are actually formal gods, what we call a pantheon, which is all of the gods together, and there's a hierarchy. And this tends to mirror the social system that's in place. And so in ancient Greece, you had a chief god. You had Zeus, who was at the top of the hierarchy. And this is because there was a hierarchical social system in Greece. And the third stage that Tyler suggested was monotheism, which is the belief in a single, all-powerful deity. And this is reclaiming a little bit of that unified spirituality, a little bit of hierarchy as well, because there's a single all-powerful deity at the top of the universe. So there is hierarchy there. We're lesser than the god. And in fact, the transition from polytheism into monotheism sometimes incorporates elements of both. So in Christianity, early Christians incorporated earlier myths of gods and goddesses, but made them into saints instead. And so they were humans, but that were imbued with divine force of the almighty, all-powerful deity. But then Tyler also suggested that because religion originated to explain things that people didn't understand, he proposed that as science comes to offer better explanations, he suggested that religion would decline in importance in society. And to some extent we see that this is actually borne out. From the decades 1990 to 2010, the number of people in the United States more than doubled, from 7% to 16%. And in Canada, it almost exactly doubled, from 12 to 25% over the same period of time. So it seems like if we follow Tyler's way of thinking, that the lack of ability to explain things, we fill those gaps with God or spirits or spirituality or religion. And when we find scientific or more logical explanations for some of these things, we fill them with that logic, and there's less of a space for spirituality to fit into that. Now, that being said, religion isn't just about what Tyler said, about the attempt to understand your daily life. There's also a social aspect to it, a community that forms, an identity that forms. So that's something that even with science, that's something that people may want to perpetuate, even with scientific explanations for the universe that go actually quite a long way. So looking a little bit more granularly at these elements of how spirituality takes place, is that we looked, I explained a concept in Polynesia last, when we were talking about marriage and kinship, the concept of mana in Polynesia. Mana is a sacred, impersonal force. It's a life force. It can reside in people, animals, plants, objects, tools, houses, places, even invisible things. And this is a sort of an animistic perspective. But at the same time, this concept of mana, as I mentioned before, is also a function of the society that's using it. And so mana is a concept that you find in many different Pacific Island cultures, but it varies in what it means depending on what kind of society is using it. So in Melanesia, for instance, mana is more like what you and I might call luck or efficacy. just a sort of chance. It's not really a very particularly powerful thing. It's fortune, good luck, good fortune, or bad luck, bad fortune. Whereas in Polynesia, so that's Melanesia, in Polynesia, mana is a much more powerful and socially controlled concept. It relates to taboos, and a taboo is a ritual, something that's sacred, but also forbidden to do, and this prohibition is backed by supernatural forces, supernatural sanctions. And so in Polynesia, mana involves not being able to touch stuff. So if there's mana in a particular object that belongs to the king or the chief, you can't touch it, or it will actually curse you, or it will harm you, or you will make that object unclean by you touching it. And so this concept of mana is strictly related to their hierarchical social structure. High chiefs had so much mana, their bodies and their possessions are considered taboo for the lowly commoners like you and me. And so this is where mana in Melanesian society is much more egalitarian, where in Polynesia, where there was a much more hierarchical social structure, you have mana actually taking on some hierarchical elements as well. Magic is a big topic that crosses over quite a few different types of religions, even some of the big ones. I sometimes joke a little bit about how my parents, I call them voodoo Catholics. And that's because they sometimes undergo certain rituals that if you do this ritual, it will compel a certain outcome. You can count on it. It's a technique that you get to accomplish specific aims, and it's to them it's considered foolproof. In fact, if you do this, you will. If you pray to Saint Anthony, you will find your lost car keys. That sort of a thing. It is magic, even though my parents might get offended if I call it magic. But magic refers to supernatural techniques intended to accomplish specific aims. And it can be things like, it can be imitative, so you can have magic from a distance, like a voodoo doll, or it can be contagious, accomplished through contact with objects or the body of other people. Now, magic, does it work? I would argue no. Some people would disagree with me, but of course these are emic perspectives, and that's not really our job here. Is not to evaluate whether magic is real or not. We are trying to look at the role that magic serves in culture and how these sorts of ritualistic formulae are used by people in those societies. And let's face it, the world is uncertain. The world has a lot of anxiety out there, and people are looking for some kind of solace. So religion, and especially things like magic, where you have formulas, where you do certain activities and you're guaranteed a particular outcome if you do it right. This provides stability and reduces your anxiety when control or understanding seems impossible. So religion helps people face up to some of these things that are hard to come to grips with, death being one of the most important ones. So this is where religion can actually, for people that have a hard time dealing with the uncontrollable, this can provide a little bit of stability. We talked a little bit about Malinowski, Branislaw Malinowski, and his work on the Trobriand Islands in a previous chapter. And he saw that the Trobriand Islanders turned to magic when they faced uncertainty or danger when they were going out in their boats. They sailed, and they were a seafaring group of people. They live in an archipelago. They have to communicate, and they have to get in their boats in order to survive. But that's a very dangerous activity. And so they had ritual activities, they had magic, they had objects, and they had formulae that they felt would ensure their safe travel. So these rituals can be religious, but rituals can also be secular. Rituals can be things that just you don't really think about it as belonging to a religion. How many of you have some lucky object, a lucky pair of socks or something like that you wear to give you a little bit of strength when you're going for that job interview or something? These are the sorts of things that these can be secular rituals that do the same sort of thing that religious rituals do as well. Also, some rituals are about initiation, joining the club, joining that group of people. If religion is an identity, how do you determine who is in the group and who is out of the group? Well, this involves what we call rites of passage, and these are rituals that mark and facilitate a person's movement from one social state of being into another. So in Native American cultures, they have what are called vision quests, where you actually have to go through a particular type of process, and when you come through it, you become a full member of that community. And rites of passage have three distinct phases, where you are separated from that group, you are considered an outsider, and you start to be drawn in, and you are put into what is called a liminal phase, liminality. And this is the period where you spend in between separation and what's called incorporation. So you start at separation, you're not part of the group, and then there's this in-between phase that you're neither part of the group nor are you separated from it. You're in sort of limbo. This is where you have left the separations phase, but you have not fully been acknowledged as having joined, as incorporated. And liminality is a part of every rite of passage. You have to go through some liminal phase, and it involves temporary suspension, sometimes even the reversal of everyday social distinctions. So forms of ritual liminality that is not religious would be something like boot camp for the military. You're no longer just a citizen, but you're not in the military yet. You are with a cohort of a group of people, and you've got people in the military that are coming against you, and they are attacking you, and they were trying to put you down to give your cohort, your boot camp cohort, a sense of togetherness. It brings people together to be in this liminal phase together, and then once that's done, everyone who has joined the military has gone through the same type of training, and so you are incorporated into that group, having gone through this liminal phase, which everybody has done. This can also be, rites of passage can be the transition from going from a child to an adult. There may be rituals that are involved with that. Something like a quinceañera is a rite of passage, or a bar or bat mitzvah, or other types of religious transitional phases from going from childhood into full adulthood. So these rites can be intense. And they serve to reinforce that group solidarity of the in-group. Everyone goes through the same process in it. And so the intensity serves to reinforce that group solidarity. Now, going on with some more practices that religions share is certain types of religions have is what's called totemism. We talked a little bit about this before in terms of tracing your kinship back to a totemic apical ancestor. And so each descent group in a totemic religious group, like Native Australians tend to be totemic in this respect. An animal or a plant or a geographical feature is their apical ancestor. They claim descent from that thing or object or place or animal. And traditionally, you don't kill or eat this sort of totemic animal, except for maybe at certain times of the year when you gather for a ceremony dedicated to that totem. And totemism can be used as a model for society. When I was talking about, in a previous chapter, I spoke about early state formation and the concept of ideology, that you have your means of production, which is what you do to survive. You have your mode of production, which is the social organization around that survival procedure. And then you have ideology, which is the justification for that social system existing. And in early state formation, you really had to come up with some justification for the way the world operated now. You had somebody at the top who seemed to have all of the rights and privileges, and you, the commoner, just were down here on this much lower rung. Well, totemism and other types of religion can serve as a model for both society, but also what we call cosmology, which is a system for imagining and understanding the way the universe operates. And so religion can actually say, God is up here, people are down here, animals are way down here, and so there's a hierarchy in religion, so you should accept the hierarchy that you have in society as well. So religion can actually mirror and give justification for social order as well. The religion's way of dealing with the uncertainties of the world was sometimes misinterpreted by early anthropologists. And because there are some practices that we see that seem to defy this very simplistic way of looking at religion as a way to understand the world. And so, for instance, when anthropologists first started examining Hindus in India, there's this doctrine, ahisma, which is the non-violence that forbids the killing of certain types of animals, especially cattle. And this was interpreted by early anthropologists as a way that religion stood in the way of economic development. But this is ethnocentric, and it's actually wrong. Because if you look at